Okay, good afternoon, everybody. It's a couple of minutes past the hour of 12. Welcome to today's event. This is the fourth in four events in our autumn series that we've been running, looking at some of the challenges in the urban policy space for the new government. We've done brownfield regeneration, we've done the future of devolution, and we've done labour market inactivity. And today we're going to do local government funding, both the current state of affairs and the future. And it's a great pleasure to have with us Tony Travers, Professor at the London School of Economics, and more particularly and relevantly, a local government guru. One of the very few people who knows local government and particularly local government funding. So it's great to have you with us, Tony.
Thank you, Andrew.
And what we're going to try and do, I think, is take a bit of a stock as to where we are and where we've got to now, bit of a history lesson, because I think not just because I think that's relevant, but also because some of that history is relevant for some of the options or choices that we might need to make moving forward. And then we'll have a look at what some of those options and issues might be. And as always, if you've got comments or questions based on what you're hearing or just things that are in your head, pop them in the Q&A channel using that function, and I'll weave them in and ask Tony as we go through. So Tony, let's start with many I guess on the call will be familiar, but just sort of paint a picture of where we are now with local government funding. We hear a lot about crisis, some already 114s, others imminent, etc. Big funding gaps depending on the numbers, but it's in the billions. How do you characterize where we are, and then we'll unpack maybe why you think we've got to where we've got to.
Okay, well, I mean, local government spending. You have a out of sight for those watching. An excellent Institute for Fiscal Studies chart recently produced showing that local government spending is 19% lower per resident than it was in 2010. So despite reasonably good settlements in the last 2-3 years, and the one for the year coming up is so-so, though it's not absolutely clear how good yet, we're still looking at spending that's 20% per capita per resident lower than it was 15 years ago. And if you were to compare that with the health service, which is seen as in need of 22 billion extra, NHS spending is 30% up in real terms over that same period, more than almost a third up. So local government's been put under massive pressure. But more than that, we saw in the early years of the Conservative-led government under the coalition, council tax kept flat, and then from the middle of the period of Conservative office, it going up sharply to the point that council tax, which though it's only 4% of all taxes, in the 4.5% of all taxes in the country, very, very visible. We should probably come back to its visibility and how easily people perceive it. So council tax has gone up. Council tax itself has never been revalued since it was introduced back in the early 1990s. Separately, the business rate system, which the government's just announced a review about, is redistributing money to local government, but in a way that, frankly, is almost impossible to understand. And then, of course, the grant system that underpins all of this and equalises for needs and resources is in desperate need of modernisation as well. So, put it at its simplest, the system has left local government with far less money to spend every year, because council tax, of course, is capped. The other two sources are set by the government. And separately, quite a number of aspects of it are badly out of date. So other than that, everything's fine.
And I mean, you made the point there. So, in big picture numbers, 20% down per capita compared to 2010. But also, the important thing there is that the way that local government has got, or local authorities have got their money, has changed quite significantly. Council tax has been doing a lot more of the funding requirements than it was back in 2010. And actually, central government grant, as part of that process, has declined even more rapidly.
Absolutely. And I mean, put that in an even more intriguing way. Over the last 15 years, we've seen more of the burden of paying for local government, or the taxes needed to pay for local government, being paid at the local level through council tax, and less at the national level through redistributed VAT and income tax and so on, which is where grants come from.
Yeah.
And of course, why this matters is council tax is enormously easy to understand. There's a terrible paradox. Even though council tax is 4 or 5% of all the taxes we pay, it's by far the most understood one. And the reason for that is people get bills through the front door. There's a lot of discussion of it by other think tanks who worry about the burden of the tax system on people.
Yeah.
So, and actually, if you do simple Google Trends type searches, you'll see that council tax is much more searched about than any other tax. So there's a real issue here that council tax is very visible, people know what they're paying, and of course there's no link between council tax and it going up and spending, really. They're completely detached.
No,
and that means accountability is not just lacking, but slightly misleading.
Yeah. And what's your sense as to, where we are? We don't definitively know. We've seen a dozen or so Section 114s, which effectively council saying we're in real financial distress. We hear varying sort of noises about, at least a significant number of others on the brink or potentially on the brink. We have these big numbers from LJ and others around, the big funding gap, particularly if you go out over, 2 or 3 years. I mean, just where do you think we are now in terms of collectively local authorities and the financial stresses they find themselves in? How do we calibrate that, I suppose?
Well, this is the right time of year to be having this discussion, because in the run up to the local government finance settlement, which will be on, I make it up, December the 20th at 4 p.m.
Yes.
Something when everybody's more or less given up for Christmas. So always late, just before Christmas. But at that point, all council representative groups, SIGOMA, the County Councils Network, district councils, London boroughs, they're all, making their case to ministers. But the truth is, the number of Section 114 notices issued is surprisingly small, and almost every one of them has been issued because of a local one-off issue.
Right.
So the only one in recent times that looks like a sort of breakdown of internal management in normal way was probably Northamptonshire, which was one of the earlier ones.
Yes. Yeah.
For Birmingham, it's the equal pay issue, Thurrock, Woking, property, issues, Croydon, ditto. So they were all one-offs, really. So if you ask the question, how many authorities generally stressed by the last 13, 14, 15 years, how many of them have issued Section 114 notices? The answer is surprisingly few. Now, we heard in the run-up to last year's local government finance settlement, members of individual subsets of the local government family say, this year, 10% of our members will be issuing Section 114 notices. Well, they didn't. And that kind of tells you that local governments, I think, started to begin to use the threat of Section 114 notices to put pressure on ministers. Actually, in fairness to the local government sector, Michael Gove, then the Secretary of State, did come up with extra money after the settlement last year. So I think there's a realisation in the core of government now that local government finance is unsustainable, particularly social care, but separately, perhaps we'll talk about this later, schools funding, which is not part of the generality of local government. It's ring-fenced, but it's in trouble for kind of separate reasons to do with the need to overspend on especially special educational needs. So you've got the threat of Section 114 notices, but surprisingly, none issued by authorities this year.
Yeah, and we'll come on to how that's playing out, and how the nature of what local government is now funding has changed quite significantly over that period. Social care being the obvious example, and the piece in the FT, I think a week or so, looking at Hampshire and the way that had changed is quite extent. And also, it'd be interesting your thoughts on, is it all local authorities or is it mainly upper tier, or where do the districts and county and unitary sit and all that? But just on local government and its position in the bigger and broader state, as you say, it highlighted and identified early on for quite significant cuts, which were then seen through over the decade or so. Why? I mean, what's your explanation as to why local government has been singled out, and it has traditionally been singled out for for quite rough financial treatment by central government?
Well, I think it's because, well, it's, central government looks after its own.
Yeah.
So the services that are directly accountable to ministers, the NHS most obviously, state pension, equally very political. These are things that the government makes decisions about and is held directly accountable for. Local government is at arm's length, and indeed, for many governments, it's their opponents who end up making the difficult decisions locally. So that's doubly attractive. But I think rather more seriously, the fact is that councils are required to balance their budgets in year. That is, they can't overspend. They can't choose or budget to spend in year more than the income they've got in terms of revenue, current spending, day-to-day spending. And against that backdrop, the government has known all along that if they reduce the amount of local government spending each year, hardworking and diligent council treasurers and directors of finance will make sure their members spend that amount. So you can guarantee the path of local government spending will come down, precisely and ironically, because local government is actually quite good at managing these things. And finance directors who've been massively empowered, I might say, by the last 15 years, none of them wants to issue a Section 114 notice. It's sort of professionally bad for them. So they're very effective at ensuring local government spending can come down to any number you think of. And of course, one of the ironies of the pressure and the uncertainty about the pressure is that councils over time have built up quite substantial reserves in total, which is a sort of completely counterfactual, against logic way of doing it. But the reason that happens is that they're always worried the future will be worse.
Right.
And it often has been.
Yes. Yeah. So let's talk a little bit, because you referred to it. Let's do it in two stages. So firstly, and they're related, is it your sense that every local authority within the system, and we have a wonderfully complicated system, is suffering equal financial strain, or is it mainly upper tier, so county and unitaries, or is it, where do districts fit in all of that? We did some work a few years ago looking at, it seemed that urban authorities, at least at the time when we did the analysis, were being harder hit than, say, non-urban authorities. But just in terms of the nature of local government, how do you have a sense as to whether it is equally, or is actually some of the certain types of authorities have had a rougher ride?
Well, in terms of the way what was then called austerity started and the cuts to local government spending after 2010, they were much deeper on urban authorities. So urban authorities in the North, the Midlands and in London, particularly inner city authorities, than more suburban and rural ones. And that still shows in the statistics. It's true that when the former government got round to levelling up, which of course it had to kind of reverse engines and start funding the very areas that had been taking money away from them in the best traditions of system public policy over time. Anyway, so that was the initial positions. I think a lot of urban authorities, particularly in the Midlands and the North, are under significant pressure. And that's not to say London ones aren't, but some of them have access to resources that come via development, which probably at the margin help their, particularly inner London. But so you've got these problems, but you now have to add to this something I referred to a moment ago: the enormous pressure, particularly on some counties, of special educational needs costs, which have driven up deficits, so-called negative reserves, very Orwellian, that councils have had to keep on their budgets, in their budgets. So they've actually been allowed by a change in government regulation to build up, effectively, to run deficits that they then hold in their accounts. And for some counties, that's a big issue. Right. And then separately, you've got the cost of temporary accommodation for housing authorities, which is harder. Those also ring-fenced, of course. Housing finance is ring-fenced. So the cost of that is falling on some district councils and particularly urban authorities. So it's different from place to place. But one of the problems we all have, this is that nobody really knows. And that's because the Audit Commission was abolished. If the Audit Commission, and I have to declare, I was a member years and years and years, long before all this started. So full disclosure. But the fact is that, so little did the government know. In fairness to SIP, the Chartered Institute of Public Finance and Accountancy, and the Local Government Association, they made their own efforts to try to work out which authorities were in trouble. And then, of course, what was then called DLUC, now Ministry of Housing, Community and Local Government, set up the Office for Local Government to try to do the same. I'm not quite sure what's happened to that since the election.
No.
That's for another programme.
Yeah.
But but the truth is, had the Audit Commission or something like it existed, they would have known which authorities were in difficulty. That's what they did. They had evidence from comparative data, from the audits that were done on local authorities. They had it collectively. They wrote management letters. So the difficulty, I think, for all of us now is to know which authorities are in real trouble and which are nearest to issuing a Section 114 notice.
And notwithstanding, obviously, the Audit Commission was abolished in the early days of the coalition when Pickles was the Secretary of State, and there was a bunch of other things that he did in terms of this sort of abolishing various institutions, etc. RDAs being another example. But so, other than his own predilection to doing that kind of thing, why does government not keep an eye on what local government is up to? I mean, it would seem sensible and reasonable to expect government, or at least somebody, to be charged with and be responsible for keeping an eye on the system, not just individual authorities, but the system at large. And I think what you're saying is we don't really have that.
We don't. We just don't. Full stop. And I mean, I think at some level this goes back to the coalition. And you mentioned, when Eric Pickles was Secretary of State. Remember, the coalition thought it was going to reduce the government's annual deficit to zero by 2015. That was the logic of austerity. Have 5 difficult years, and then the sunlit uplands of a return to growth and public spending for all. Well, of course, the deficit never got anywhere near zero and is now growing even further yet again, as a result of the current government's decisions. So we never got to the happy point that somehow the pressure would be off local government. So local government would continue to be under pressure. And the only thing that really changed the government's mind was the penny dropping realization that social care was completely unsustainable and was going to take all other spending out of local government. The famous Barnett graph of doom, which showed that. So I think the problem is that nobody envisaged it would go on like this year in, year out. And we'd end here, as we said at the beginning, with local government spending per resident 20% lower than it was 15 years ago. So I think that explains, the government thought there wouldn't be the need to go on with this cuts or the pressure on local government spending. And therefore, presumably, there wouldn't be a need for something like the Audit Commission to work out. Now, that's a kindly interpretation. A less kindly interpretation is that had there been an Audit Commission, it would have been reporting on all of this. And if you look at the National Audit Office, very different kind of body, parliamentary body that looks at national government, they have looked at local government's systemic position, and their reports have been incredibly good at pointing out the pressure on the sector. Well, had the Audit Commission have existed, it would have done that in detail. Not great for the government, I suspect.
And let's just round off the sort of where we are current picture in terms of funding. So just you mentioned it already, but the nature of what local government is funding now has changed quite dramatically. Money shrinking, demand in certain respects, in certain things, increasing quite rapidly over that period, which effectively has, I think, changed quite significantly what local authorities are doing now. So, I mean, just say a little bit about that, because I think that also touches on like a bigger question, which is in part where we are in some of the devolution conversation, which is what is the role and purpose of local government within the state and the state apparatus. And so just how is what local government now doing, or at least funding, how has that changed, and where does that leave us, where we are now?
Well, given that schools funding was sort of ring-fenced, not completely taken away, it still runs through local government's books, as we just discussed. But if you look at the general fund, local government's overall general fund, then social care has grown as a share of that to being 60 or 65 or even 70%, I think in some cases, of council's overall spending. And that means everything else has been squeezed. So street cleaning, street lighting, refuse collection and disposal, parks, all the things people see outside their front doors have been cut harder, much harder than these average figures, I might say. And so, had the former government gone out of its way to make sure people understood what austerity looked like, we've hardly done it more effectively. All the things people couldn't see, high speed 2, spending on high speed 2, totally invisible. Well, just if you're on the line, but you see what I mean.
Yeah.
Or defence, or all these other things, very hard to work out. But you can see what's going on outside your front door, and that's where big cuts have taken place. So local government has ended up in that awkward position of having to deliver cuts right on people's front doors. And that's, so but to go back to answer your question fully, spending on social care has had to rise, and in effect partly ring-fenced, leading to a debate about whether social care should be taken away from local government. You know, very odd logic that somehow you underfund it for a long time, then it doesn't perform very well, then you take it away from local government. And by the way, this is going to be given rococo further detail by the demands of the national insurance increase on the private sector falling on the social care sector. Well, it doesn't fall on the NHS, and that, as I say, is very much work in progress.
Yeah.
So I think, if you stand back from all of this, it's, in some ways, it's just too difficult. The government's got too many levers to pull and too many bits of string to push, and it doesn't quite work out. I don't think it gives the impression, not just this government, but its predecessor, of having made all these different changes, how it all fits together, and they have no way of, measuring it.
And we'll come on to a little bit about, I mean, by the way, if you've got questions or comments, please put them in the Q&A, and we'll insert them into the conversation as appropriate. I mean, we'll come on to what we think how we might move forward on this, but it's a slightly odd question, but how important is it that we do get a reasonable grip on how the system is working and all the different sort of factors and how they interact and how they play off each other? How important is it for us to be able to do that in order then to plot our way forward? Or, in a classic way, can we, in the absence of that comprehensive sort of understanding, can we muddle through? I mean, how do you think about that? Because the first option is always the ideal world. We understand fully what the system is, and then we can figure out how to make it work better or differently. Is that feasible? Is that even possible? I mean, I don't know.
Well, this is Britain. We can muddle through forever, so let's we can all feel good about that.
Yeah.
However, there are various aspects of the local government finance system which are completely indefensible and unsustainable, really.
Yeah.
So just take council tax never being revalued. Difficulty is the longer you leave it without revaluing it, and Centre for Cities has done noble work on this issue. The longer you leave it without revaluing it, the more massive the redistributive effect, which put politicians off ever doing it.
Yeah.
And by the way, there would be elements of retrospective impact if you tell people, well, we haven't revalued your home for council tax purposes for 30 plus years, but now we're going to do it. That is a bit difficult for some people.
Yeah.
So there's that problem. The underlying grant system needs updating. There's been a fair funding review, it's been called, over several years. And the reason that no government can really introduce any of that is that you can't do it unless you have extra money, because otherwise you're just taking money from one set of councils and giving it to another from a starting point where they're all getting less, they're all spending less than they were 15 years ago. So that doesn't sound very entrancing either.
Yeah.
Business rates has now become, the government's just put out a consultation paper on business rates, and the way that now operates, which is partly a business issue. I mean, what's the impact on the high street?
Yes.
But partly a local government finance issue, because local government receives in a recycled way money in ways determined by the government, and so on. So it's both an economic development issue and a local government finance issue and a devolution issue because of retention deals.
Yeah.
So you've got all of these things in play at once, and that's before you get to schools funding and housing funding, which are separately a quagmire.
Yeah. Starting to get some questions in, and rightly and understandably asking about where we go, and partly about the reform of the system, and then increasingly we see councils trying to figure out how they might work around the edges, sort of in spite of the system. And again, everybody on the call, because that's our community, will know. Firstly, it didn't used to be like this. I mean, the way the local government is funded is is because of what it is right now. It didn't used to be like that back in the 70s or even into
So it's
the
been quite
80s.
complicated.
It's always been complicated.
But it started out not complicated. In the 19th century, it was dead easy.
Yeah,
You know, the council
straightforward.
raised money and spent it locally. Oh,
Yeah.
that's it. Yeah.
So there is a degree of complication, and the system as it is the reflection of choices and decisions that have been made along the way. There's not anything natural, as it were, and reflecting that. There's nothing particular. Well, there is something particular about our system, but other systems in other countries to look very different as well. So there are other models out there, which I think is important when we're trying to imagine the future on this sort of stuff. So thinking about where we are and then I guess the future. I mean, we saw a little bit in the recent budget a couple of weeks ago, short-term year or two increase, just more cash into the system. Quite a reasonable amount of cash, particularly but not exclusively orientated around social care. So I just wonder, in your kind of immediate thoughts about where we are dealing with the problem, is it as simple as we just need to inject more cash? I mean, irrespective of where it comes from for a minute, but just more cash needs to be inserted into the system, and that will help resolve some of the immediate pressures. And then I think there's a medium term, which is about where local government gets its money from, how it manages all of that kind of stuff. But just give us the short term. Is it as simply as we need a lot more cash in the system?
A lot more cash. I mean, if we were a treasury, I were a treasury official, you were asking that question, I said, well, most of local government works perfectly well today, doesn't it? No Section 114 notices, heard somebody saying earlier this year. So what's the problem? And I think the trouble with that, which is, definitely the sort of the treasury, it will be the treasury line, is that they don't apply that to other parts of public spending. And the truth is that what's happened to local government is undoubtedly undermining real public services that people notice, and the sort of gradual attrition in the quality of the local environment and the high street and all of that. These are things people notice. There's loads of polling that show that people judge their lives and how happy they are, well-being and so on, in part by what the place they live in looks like and feels like. So this is much more serious than local government. I'm not saying you're saying local going up. And of course, in fairness to your question, Michael Gove Michael Gove was incredibly effective at getting money out of the Treasury for local government when he was responsible, and Angela Rayner has managed to do it this year. So we've now had 3 or 4 years when actually the local government finance settlement is would be sustainable, right? So that from local government's point of view, it doesn't take us anywhere near back to 2010, but it would be manageable, I think, and it would stop council finance officers fretting that the 3rd and 4th year out are going to be worse. And the trouble is, as commentators, the Resolution Foundation here and the IFS have pointed out, the 3rd and 4th year out from this set of spending figures discussed in the budget is bad again for the unprotected services. And so, a finance director is going to say, well, next year, 25, 26 is going to be fine. Year after, a bit less certain, but the next 2 years look bad. And so the pressure on the system won't really be much reduced, because finance officers will fear that they're going to have to make cuts again 2 years out, 3 years out, and 4 years out. And that it's not sustainable. And
that's not the ideal. You don't, in that uncertain world,
planning.
It's not efficient,
and you'll end up with cuts still being made against the backdrop that the council's fear that the 3rd and 4th year out are going to be bad again.
What's your so partly, what we've heard this from the previous government, didn't really do it, but this government committed to do it. We'll see in the spending review in the spring, which will look into the the few years beyond the immediate. A big emphasis, or a reasonable emphasis, on setting 3-year settlements or 4-year settlements, which is partly cash related. 3 years of nothing is still nothing, or not very much. But how significant do you think a sort of 3-year spending horizon and a commitment to not meddle then within the 3 years, which is what we've typically seen, even though they've done this in the past? how significant do you think that is for the way that local authorities might be able to think about that sort of term and how they appropriate their cash? And do you think, I suppose you say year on year, really they have to operate, whether there would actually be a 3-year cycle where, you know, the cash flow might be a bit more variable year in year within the 3 years?
I mean, a 3-year, I mean, local government's desperate for 3-year settlements, so they'll be happy if they get one. I mean, happier still if it shows, you know, flat or in real terms or something slightly better than that. But even that's not quite as good as it looks, because if there's any redistribution, and, you know, fairness dictates there will have to be a review of how needs are calculated, and it would leave some authorities better off and some worse off in terms of distribution of grant. So the uncertainty doesn't really go away unless you've got a sustained period when local government as a whole can be reasonably certain that, you know, funding for each council will be pretty secure in real terms, allowing for population growth. I haven't already talked about population, fast population growth in many parts of the country. So unless council finance officers, I've mentioned several times, are reasonably certain that their council is going to face no cuts to its day-to-day spending 3 years out, there'll always be the pressure to cut here and there, to just in case, because they're very cautious people. And
the government hasn't said anything about whatever its version of fair funding, you know, the updated needs assessment, let's call it that. They haven't really said anything about that. At least I haven't seen any of that. Which will really, that's about setting a new, you know, a more up-to-date baseline as to what we think councils need to deal with the needs, as you know, that are in their place as they currently are.
Yes, but again, if you think about it, so absolutely that's what it is. But imagine, I think if there were to be significant revision of spending need figures and new population numbers coming into the system, there would be some authorities that would get a lot more money and others that would get a lot less money. But those that get less, they just have to cut because they got no extra, unless the government decides to get rid of or reduce the impact of capping. So as in Wales, you know, no capping in Wales. Complicated, controversial form of trying to keep council tax down in Scotland, but in England it has a sort of capped annual council tax increase. So one of the things I'm interested to see in the local government finance settlement, though it wasn't mentioned in the budget, is whether the government is a bit more generous on the council tax capping front, which would be a way of getting some more money in, albeit one that further increases council tax.
Yes, and has a distributional effect between the ability to where additional rises and how much revenue is generated from a 1%. You know,
working women raise more than Barnsley, and that's a perennial issue. But yes, and of course, you know, the government, this government, new government's hemmed in by, you know, the fact that this is a tiny, well, local government isn't a tiny part, it's a part of a much bigger public spending picture, which itself is very, very challenging, as we've just heard in the response to the budget.
Yes, yeah. We've had quite a few questions on, in various ways, basically around the scope and the potential for local authorities to raise additional revenues outside of, you know, the council tax, business rates, you know, grant, which essentially is doing the lion's share of the funding for most places, nearly all places. You know, things like revenues from parking charges or from licenses or from increasingly from business improvement districts and or tourism taxes and all the rest of it. I mean, firstly, you know, what's your sense of that? But also, how significant is a lot of that? I mean, is it you know, marginal stuff that we should pay attention to, but it's marginal stuff and will always be? Or do you think there's real scope to, you know, to significantly scale that up, or to give more places the possibility of scaling that up?
Well, it's a great question. And if you sort of divide, let's just put to one side the more radical possibilities of reforming local government finance to bring it more in line with other countries comparable to Britain, which were discussed in the Layfield Committee's report back in the 70s and touched on, but not actually advocated by the Lyons inquiry back in the in 2007.
Yeah.
So so if you look at the slightly more of our time, what could be done quickly, then I think the business improvement districts are interesting, not present everywhere, but in many cities they now are. And at the margin, the money they raise for sort of cleaning the streets and maintaining them and putting up Christmas trees, to be topical, at the margin is important, because at the margin, these very much cut budgets on those kind of services, what they do can be very important indeed. So I think BIDS has produced a new spending line indirectly for local government. Now, on tourism taxes, it would seem to me it'd be relatively easy for a government that's just had a budget of the kind it had, which was trying to, but rather simplistically, increase taxes, but in ways that people didn't directly feel.
Yeah.
Then taxing tourists, particularly in places where the large number of overseas tourists, wouldn't be that onerous. Now, be some pushback from the industry, the hotel industry, tourism industry, but I mean, most of us are used to going overseas and paying, €8 or whatever it is, and then in America, a long list of tourism and related taxes. And oddly enough, the sky hasn't fallen in for their tourist industry. So I do think it would be well worth the government looking at allowing, it could be permissive, allowing local authorities to introduce tourism levy and possibly other levies besides. I mean, the government wants to, improve public health. There are ways that councils could be given freedom, not complicated, I can see, but to raise revenues by changing taxes locally that in a way that encourages particular behaviour. So I think it's well worth looking at all of that. Fees and charges perennial. I think the government is going to allow fees for planning to go up, which is a rational thing to do. And so I do think it's worth looking at all of those smaller income sources. Park reform of the council tax, we can talk about that if we want. And then, but I do think it's worth not forgetting that not that far ago in the past, people did ask bigger questions like, would it be possible to have a local income tax or a more widespread reform, which I think devolution, particularly city regional devolution, does beg some of those questions, because we want to incentivize growth.
Yes.
And at the moment, this system of local government finance provides almost random incentives to growth. It's very hard to make a decision as a local authority in a big city or elsewhere, knowing what effect it'll have on your tax yield, and that's not great.
Yeah. And some form of either a local income tax or sharing of income tax at the local level, different version. I mean, that goes back, probably before, you'll know, but it goes back at least to the Layfield report, which is what, mid-70s.
And Scotland and Wales have done it, you see.
Yes.
I mean, and it's always but Wales, I always think, is a really interesting case here, because although Wales, it's 3.25 million people, much bigger, but it's not population-wise, not much bigger than a city region in England.
No.
So, if Wales can do it, it's hard to, can be given some greater tax autonomy and then begin to think about building up the tax base in Wales and in Scotland, separately for the Scottish government. Hard to see why it wouldn't work in the same way or reasonably in England.
So this is an unfair question. We'll come on to council tax in a minute. I mean, let's take the tourism taxes bucket, in a sense, ability to raise taxes at the margin on a variety of things. How, we don't know, and then this is where the unfairness comes in. How likely do you think that the Treasury would give local government the freedom and the flexibility to introduce some of those things beyond what we've already had? If you were betting on this, it's a difficult one because can you see why they might be more inclined to do it in the near future than they have in the past? Because they obviously have been reluctant to do all of this sort of stuff, although ironically they've done it in Scotland and they've done it in different things.
But that, and of course, interesting, Scotland and Wales initially, though, came more in Scotland because of the threat of, if they weren't given more power, it could lead to greater demands for independence.
Yes.
Part of it. But I think new government, I mean, the devolution to Wales and Scotland happened with the new government when government's most powerful just after it's elected. And the current government is at its most powerful, let's assume, and also desperate for new revenue streams. And although the Treasury will be automatically against all of this, fact is they have conceded things in the past. So we discussed business improvement districts, congestion charging, things like the ultra low emission zone and things such as that, which do produce revenue at the margin. So they have, through gritted teeth, allowed these things to be introduced and retained and not equalised away, by the way. So for a government that's absolutely desperate for new revenue sources, particularly ones that people in Britain don't much feel, I'd have thought a tourism tax was, I mean, as easy as they get, really. If you think about how many people from overseas would end up paying it. So, so to answer your question, I think there is a small period now when the Treasury might be suggestible or inched across the line with one or two of these things. The other thing it's worth adding, given I mentioned congestion charging, and you know, the power councils have to levy on off-street parking. Councils have been incredibly unwilling to use those forms of revenue raising. And as far as congestion charging is concerned, I've long slightly been worried that if local government doesn't use it, and we've got the central London charge, that's it. Eventually, a government's going to come along and do it nationally, through gritted teeth, but you know, to raise revenue. And the councils would lose access to that revenue stream. So I think that's something else.
That's impending on. We're going to have some form of road pricing system because inevitably we'll have to, right? Just because of the decline in fuel duty revenues and vehicle excise duties as we switch over to, you know, to non-fossil fuel forms of driving around, right?
And I know that the politics of cars and driving are incredibly difficult to get that. But the truth is, there is a risk that eventually local government, having had this revenue source, it would be a big one for some cities, will risk losing it, having never used it. That would be an irony indeed.
So let's go through not necessarily a sliding scale. So all things being equal, kind of bit of confidence around optimism, or I suppose on some of those sort of things. You touched a little bit on council tax. It's just optimism. So I mean, there's lots of reform that could be done to council tax, and you know, we've set out a set of proposals. I know you've got your own thoughts on what could be done. But at the base level, they all start with a revaluation from 91 to some point closer to the current day. Have to work from that basis. And then other things you could do on top. Optimism that is ever going. I mean, is it ever going? I mean, again, it's an unfair question, but is it ever going to happen?
Well, it will have to happen in some shape or form. And it's worth remembering that there was, I mean, the old domestic rating system wasn't revalued for a long period, and then eventually a government had to revalue it back in 1974, I think it was. And then it was the fear of revaluing it, or the threat of revaluation, or the need to revalue it, that fatally led to the brave decision to introduce the poll tax. Now, of course, the lesson of the poll tax is carved in stone in Whitehall, and I think all ministers of all parties know this. That is that if you revalue, now in fairness, the Welsh government has revalued.
They have,
but if you revalue, particularly in England after 33 years, well, since they were first set, I mean, the date they were set, the values were set at, I mean, there would be massive redistributions. You'd get people moving from band A to band H in a step, and that's before the idea of introducing higher bands. So even though it's obviously the right thing to do in principle, I think politicians of all parties would be very fearful of the impact in practice, not least of which is because many of the people who'd end up paying more would tend to be older people in homes whose values have gone up a lot since 1991, who happen to be, coincidentally, heavy voters. So you've got that additional challenge. So none of this is to say it shouldn't happen. I'm sort of looking into the real politics of what ministers in an environment where all politicians of all parties fear their party
Yeah.
is now terminally
But
unpopular.
could you imagine a world where, for example, because of those reasons, again, whether they would take it up is a secondary issue, which we come on to, but can you imagine a world where it's that the government would say, we're going to give combined authorities and London, right, the mayor of London, we're going to give you powers and flexibility to essentially to recalibrate your council tax system in your patch, and you can figure out how you're going to do it and how you redistribute between, let's say, great amounts between the 10 boroughs, as well as between households, etc., depending on where they are. Could you imagine that that would be a sort of an intermediate, a halfway house to avoid a full revaluation, or is that just not, do you think that's just pie in the sky?
No, I think that would be, I mean, I know the Centre for Cities has done work on this, and I think it's by far the more likely thing to be plausible, because if the effects are contained within the city region or whatever configuration you've got in other parts of the country, when and if devolution is finalised, then that would clearly be, I mean, the redistributive effects would be far smaller. And within any area, they probably look more fair and logical. So it's true that people in, rich big homes in nice areas which have gone up a lot would end up paying more. But if they saw the money, as we were reducing the council tax of people not so far away who were living in less nice homes, in less nice areas, you can physically see that's a piece of local impact that you might just feel comfortable about. But if it's going from you to people in other parts of the country, harder to get that sense of, convivial local civic identity.
Yeah, I agree with that. Let's do so we've got 10 minutes. Let's do local government reorganization.
Right.
In the last 10 minutes or less. So, and how this kind of folds into the conversation we've been having about funding pressures and whether reorganization is a mechanism by which some of those funding pressures can be managed. And I think there's probably two simple ways. They're too simple, but two simple ways. One is if you bring several authorities together, do you get any, you get some cost reductions on overheads, etc., through transaction costs are limited, etc. Don't know if that's true. Some of the literature seems to suggest yes, but the numbers aren't very big. So that's one way. I suppose the other way is you can do some of this, like we just discussed. You can do some of these bigger reforms and do them at the devolved authority, but it needs to be bigger. What's your sort of take on the way that the local government reorganisation debate is ebbing and flowing currently?
Well, I mean, just to answer the first part of the not quite asked question. I mean, I think the evidence on reorganising local government for savings and efficiencies is vanishingly small.
Yeah.
I mean, I just think, so let's park that one. Separately, it seems to me almost inevitable there's going to be a further round of reorganisations to make some, to allow England to have what Scotland and Wales both already have, Northern Ireland has indeed, which is a consistent form of devolution within England. Because at the moment, the fact we've got several different city regional models and then almost random other models, Cornwall's different to everywhere and everywhere's different to everywhere else. That, in a sense, it's not an argument for absolute consistency, but until there's a way of devolving to all parts of England in some reasonably comprehensible and consistent way, I think it will make it more difficult to go further with devolution in England, even in the places that already have, combined authorities. So I think that there will probably, and having, counties and districts and a combined authority looks a bit over-governed in British terms. In France, these things work very well, but in Britain, we want, fewer tiers. So I think against that backdrop, there will probably have to be, particularly in non-metropolitan England, there will be further rounds of reorganisation. I expect the government will look at it at some point.
And do you think that is, it's tied into then those questions around, by doing that unlocks a broader suite of possibilities on the funding and the funding side, in the sense that no, it doesn't have to happen, but if it does happen, that makes conversations about some of the other reforms on the funding side we talked about, a bit easier to do.
Yes, I mean, I think it would. If you could achieve a completely, this is, it's not going to happen, a completely consistent form of devolution, or at least local government structure within England, so complementing the existing city regions with non-metropolitan, acceptable non-metropolitan versions of that, then the idea of passing new tax raising powers or tax growth incentivizing powers to them would be easier than the current situation where you can say, well, in the West Midlands or Greater Manchester or Leeds, Liverpool City region, West Yorkshire, London, they can have these powers, but non-metropolitan England can't. And you have to say it to see that that isn't the way government operates. Although we've got things like trailblazers and and some of the business rate retention. We're already slightly on that path, he said, arguing against himself.
No, quite. Because I think, and it's an interesting one around how far do we think, when we see the devolution white paper in hopefully at some point this month in some of the rumours, before the end of November, how far government is willing to set out what it wants to see in places, but also to be a bit more deliberate about making it happen in some places, which it hasn't happened for a variety of reasons. Because that's it, to get a full coverage of the English map, there is going to be a bit of government making it happen in the face of some resistance in various ways in some places.
No, I mean, what does the government do about a county and its districts that just want to be left alone?
Yeah.
Is, in the end, all reorganisations involve some degree of top-down decision making, and of course it leaves us with the perennial paradox that devolution has to be partly a centralised process.
Yes, yeah.
And when a country as centralised as England, that's definitely true. But one thing I forget it. I think we discussed this a bit earlier. I think it would be it's axiomatic to this government, which has put growth right at the front of its window of shining things it wants to deliver, and it really does need. If you look at the American election result, it tells us lots of things, but the one it really tells us more than anything is that people don't feel better off. Chances of an incumbent government surviving are close to nil.
Yeah.
And with that in mind, I think incentivizing city regions to start, because they have lots of opportunities, lots of brownfield land, lots of opportunities to develop, but giving them huge incentives to develop. Because as I said a moment ago, at the moment, the way the local tax system operates and efforts of business rate retention, it's so hard for councils to make decisions about development or attract development, knowing that they'll get permanent increase to their tax yield. And I think we've just got to make this possible. I think
what would you do in that? What would be the one or two or the two or three sort of big things you would do to really sharpen or significantly increase the the development incentive?
I think councils would have to know they keep the council tax and the business rate for some time. I mean, governments have tried this with business rate retention and with the new homes bonus, but at the moment, and they're always tinkering with these things. So you really need to tell councils, if you do this, you'll get a share or you'll keep the yield. Now, there's an equalisation consequence to that. I get that. You could go further and give them incentives with national taxes.
Yeah.
If you really wanted to incentivise growth, because if councils thought, the more we go for growth, the more money we will keep, then that would undoubtedly encourage them to develop much more than, because at the moment you can see why people push back against development in many places, because they get all the development nearby and none of the benefits because they're taken by the exchequer, directly or indirectly. So that is very, very bad. So I do think now, and on the equalisation front, there are good, England, separately Scotland and Wales have very powerful equalisation arrangements. But there are ways of dealing with authorities that get left behind, and they probably ought to be something other than using the equalisation arrangement. You need a sort of separate set of interventions, which, by the way, takes us into a whole new world for another event of this kind, no doubt, with somebody else, about what's going to be the successor to levelling up.
Yes.
Because despite the fact it not being called that
No.
anymore, there will be such policies. So I think thinking through how we could create greater incentives inside the existing local government finance system, so councils know if they develop, they keep money, and then saying to authorities that are not as successful, not their own fault, how do we help you push up your development potential with separate funding, would be a much better way to go.
Yeah. And final thought, Tony, in terms of your avid watcher as we are, really, in terms of the sort of government schedule, a government program of, obviously we have a white paper scheduled for some point, hopefully in November, as I've said, spend review in April. When you think about some of these sort of, do you think there are kind of big milestones where we'll be clearer as to where their thinking is, or is this an iterative, ongoing program? Because I also take your point, which is, if you want to do something significant and sizable, you probably want to do it as soon as after the election as you possibly can. And there is an iterative process you can go through, but actually, if you want to do something significant, you probably want to get on and do it. So, what's the schedule for that?
Well, both for that. Well, it's both for that reason, which I completely agree with, but also, the government wants to produce lots of growth quickly. And, I know they've only been in power 3 or 4 months, whatever it is by now. But, they really do need to give, in their own interest, the impression of urgency here. So I think it would be good to hear from them as early as possible, later this year through the devolution white paper, next year, the spending review, between times when they make other announcements, how they're going to incentivize local areas to develop, because without that, and there are, house building numbers falling, not going up.
Yes, yeah.
So it's not as if, and there are knock-on consequences to all of this, but I do think it's in the government's own best interest to tell local government as soon as possible how local government can contribute to the delivery of the growth that, in fairness, the government and most parties need and want.
Indeed. I think that's a great point on which to finish. As always, Tony, it's been a pleasure having you. Thank you very much indeed. I hope you enjoyed all of that. Until the next time, take care and stay safe. Thanks for listening.